Welcome to The Criminologist, the podcast dedicated to educating and entertaining our listeners. We bring you subject matter experts from around the world and share the latest and greatest evidence-based practices and interventions to help individuals desist from a life of crime and delinquency. This podcast avoids stereotypes and biases in favor of the lived experiences of those we can best learn from. Now, please welcome the host of The Criminologist, Joseph Arvidsson.
Hello, and welcome to episode 135 of The Criminologist Podcast. Happy to have you all with us today. This week, we are bringing you yet another special hybrid edition as we are teaming up with our good friends at the American Probation and Parole Association, APPA, in particular, their International Relations Committee. We hope to weave in more and more of these special edition episodes in the future, so stay tuned in particular for those. Now, for those of you who may not be aware of the American Probation and Parole Association, allow me to bring you some brief contextual information before I share my conversation with this week's very special guest, Sylvie Blanchet. The APPA really is the voice of the community corrections industry. APPA serves as the field's leading professional membership association. Their work is supported by thousands of passionate members throughout the United States and Canada, as well as other countries actively involved in strengthening community corrections work. APPA has members at all levels of the government and private sector, including community corrections professionals, service providers, libraries and educators, researchers, students, volunteers, concerned citizens, corporations, public policy advocates, and others with an interest in criminal and juvenile justice. Everything APPA does is aimed at reducing recidivism to keep our communities safe. Prior to the founding of APPA, community corrections professionals had no collective voice. Having no national representation fighting for best practices and policies in our field inspired some of America's most distinguished correctional administrators to act. Now, they accomplished this in a variety of ways. They publish their Perspectives magazine, as well as research reports, guides, and webinars. And I really encourage you to check out their web-based products and services. They also host training institutes, leadership institutes, on-site training, as well as online training. In fact, I'm going to talk about some of those upcoming training institutes after my interview with Sylvie, so stay tuned for that. And of course, APPA advocates for evidence-based practices and policies in the field. They organize committees, host issue-specific working groups, and lead a variety of focus groups. In the description of this episode, I've left several APPA links, so if you're curious, want to get more involved, I encourage you to check those out. Now let's get to my conversation with this week's very special guest, Sylvie Blanchet. Sylvie Blanchet is Executive Vice Chairperson for the Parole Board of Canada. She previously served as the Regional Director General of the Atlantic Region for the Parole Board of Canada. And of course, Sylvie is a member of APPA's International Relations Committee. Our hope is to highlight some of the great work APPA and their members do on the international front, and Sylvie does not disappoint. As you are about to hear, Sylvie and I make more than one reference to Dr. Ralph Sarin, so I want to give you some background as to him as well. I first met Dr. Sarin at an International Community Corrections Association conference in Reno, Nevada, many years ago, and the connection we established then helped introduce me to the wonderful world of desistance from crime. Ralph Sarin is a professor at Carleton University in Ottawa, and as you will hear referenced in today's interview, he and his team have been pioneers, really, when it comes to measuring desistance correlates. His tool, The DRAOR, which stands for Dynamic Risk Assessment for Offender Reentry, was actually highlighted on this podcast back in episode 36. So if you are down with desistance and wondering if scales exist to measure our client's trajectory on that continuum, the answer is yes. Check out episode 36 or reach out to me for training options regarding the DRAOR tool. And now, please enjoy my conversation with Sylvie Blanchet, and I will see you all on the other side. Well, welcome to the show, Sylvie, and thank you so much for being a guest for another APPA special edition in which we are hoping to specifically shine a light on and highlight some of the great work being done by the International Relations Committee. Why don't we start off by you telling us a little bit about yourself, generally speaking, a little bit of your background, both educationally and vocationally.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Joe, for having me today on the podcast. So I've been working in the criminal justice field since 1992. I'm a graduate of the School of Social Work from l'Université de Moncton, and I say it in French because it's a francophone university in New Brunswick, Canada. And as a student in social work, I actually interned with the Correctional Service of Canada. And following my internship, I was one of the very lucky ones, or the lucky few, I should say, who stayed on and got a job. So early on, I was quite young and started working as a parole officer, as a program officer. I worked in a minimum, medium, maximum security male prisons, the boots on the ground. But then I went to the administration and worked at both regional and national offices of the Correctional Service of Canada. And in 2008, I left there and I came to the Parole Board. And I came as a manager, and ironically, I was a manager responsible to train our board members. And I say ironically because as executive vice chairperson, it is also my portfolio, or part of my portfolio. And so at the board, I was responsible at that time for a portfolio on victims, on communications, board member training, like I said. And then I became the regional director general. That would be the senior staff member responsible for the office and the operations. And in our region at that time, and it's still like that, we have 4 provinces: Nova Scotia, Prince Edward Island, Newfoundland, and New Brunswick. And in 2018, I was appointed as the Parole Board's executive vice chairperson, which I still am in today. And so here I'm responsible for a number of things, but related to board member appointments, training for them, quality assurance, our professional standards for board members. And I say the 2IC, but to our chairperson, Jennifer Odes is the chairperson of the Parole Board of Canada. And so we together both came in 2018, and it's been a very interesting. So I guess in a nutshell, that's my career so far.
We are going to talk a lot about the Parole Board, but you mentioned a couple of times the Correctional Service of Canada, which I'm familiar with, but many of our listeners, particularly in the United States, may not be. So maybe just for context, Sylvie, can you talk about CSC?
Sure. Well, I can just tell you the Correctional Service of Canada in our country is responsible, to manage the offender's sentence. So they house offenders, they give them programs, they supervise them in the community. The Parole Board, as an independent administrative tribunal, we make the decision. So we're outside of that department. And so, for example, it gets a little, I think some people think, for example, that parole officers would work for the Parole Board when in fact they don't. They work for the Correctional Service of Canada. Our tribunal makes decisions. So just in the context of that.
Yeah, exactly. So now, as noted, in terms of parole, which represents a big part of about what the Parole Board of Canada does, just explain how that works in Canada, who's eligible for parole, and how those decisions are made. So the decisions we have as an administrative, independent administrative tribunal. So in Canada, offenders, for the most part, have start and end date sentences. So we have fixed sentences, but everybody's eligible at one point for conditional release in our country, even those serving life sentences.
So the majority of offenders in our prisons are serving determinate sentences, so the fixed sentences, which would mean that eventually they will be released. But the eligibility also exists for offenders serving life, as I said. It's not automatic, obviously. It's still an assessment. It's not a guarantee. Public safety is always our primary consideration. And, being on a lot of people think that being on conditional release or being granted a parole means that you're shortening a sentence, which you're not. It really is the supervision continues, in the community. And, there's a lot of great, I talked about corrections already, correctional service, but there's also, really great community organizations out there that do a lot of work with offenders. So being able to, recognize that people can change and that we're able to, assess offenders at the right place at the right time for their release. And of course, the headlines sometimes are very negative, right? Because we are usually in the media when something hasn't gone well. But, for the last 10 years in our country, we've demonstrated that 99% of releases on parole, not statutory release, which is that legislative release, but on parole, day or full parole, do not result in a new revocation or a conviction for a new violent offense. So it's a pretty high success, but I think there's a lot that goes into that. So suffice it to say that it's not, that's not the news we usually hear about. So I love being able to talk about it. You mentioned in the question, how are decisions made? So we have board members who make our decisions. So we're very lucky in our country to have 84 board members supported by an incredible team of staff. So the decision maker is the board member. So as board members, we are appointed for 3 to 5 years, and parole decisions are made either by way of a hearing, by way of an office vote. The legislation in Canada is prescriptive in terms of which reviews need to have a hearing, but the law also permits any board member to ask for a hearing when one is not there. So we have at our hearings, we try to be, because the idea is to gather information that you don't have on file, because we have a fairly rigorous process of, I'll say, building the file, but the Correctional Service of Canada provides a lot of information to the board right from the courts, the judges' comments, the psychology reports, etc. And so our board members study and follow a structured decision-making. Earlier, prior to the podcast, we were talking about Dr. Ralph Sarin, and Ralph designed that for us at the board. And it's one of the things that I'm hoping to talk about later when we talk about the APAI. But our board members, when they're doing a hearing, an offender is entitled to ask if they're Indigenous for an elder-assisted hearing, for example, where we have Indigenous elders who also participate to be able to help our board members not make the decision, but provide information about communities where offenders are going. Or sometimes we'll actually hold the hearing in the community, and they're called community-assisted hearings. So if there's an Indigenous offender wanting to return home, we'll actually come out and hold our hearings there. So our hearings can vary. In the last 3 years, we've introduced a trauma-informed hearings, initially for women offenders, because it's pretty fantastic. To me, it's a really great innovation, because introducing those hearings, we know from courtrooms, for example, where these are used, that they are in fact working well and it's effective. So you really want to maximize the potential of offenders to be able to express themselves at hearings. Doesn't change the risk assessment, right? We anchor our decision in risk, and then this past year, we actually, in one of our regions, introduced Black cultural advisors to how, the overrepresentation, of course, of, I spoke about Indigenous, but also of Black offenders, and trying to really bring, that piece that would be helpful to board members in making their decisions, what programs are out there, what interventions, and how they can best make their decision, and if they grant, what conditions that they would put. So all of that in a nutshell to say there's a lot of information to consider. But we're very incredibly lucky to be supported by a team of staff who sometimes come to hearings with our board members, right? Our hearing officers, but also we have a communication staff who attend with victims and prepare victims who come to hearings, et cetera, et cetera. So the decision making is really anchored in risk and in the structure.
This is so fascinating to me. Unfortunately, we get much of what we know about criminal justice, even I as a practitioner, from media. And we generally in the United States operate under a system of determinate sentencing. But we phased out parole boards in most of our states long ago. So most of what we see about that is, in the movies or on some cheesy reality TV show where there's the three board members and they're looking through the pre-sentence investigation and asking some questions. But as you've articulated, Sylvie, in Canada, there's much more due diligence, and you're really bringing a lot of science into the equation. You mentioned our mutual friend, Dr. Ralph Sarin, who I have had the honor of working with, and I know when he's talked to me about, for example, his desistance scales, he's always talking about his work with the parole board, but now you're really giving a lot of great context to that. So yeah, let's circle back to that later on in the interview. I know we're going to talk about the Association of Paroling Authorities International, but yeah, this really gives a lot of good context to the due diligence that is given to parole decisions in Canada. And you mentioned, of course, at the tail end there, victims are also included in this process, correct?
Correct. So yeah, and they play a really important part because the victims or survivors have a lot of information that they can share with the board. And as an independent administrative tribunal, we operate in a very open manner. So we have, media can attend our hearings, victims can attend the hearings. But the only participant other than the offender and the actual participants, the victim can actually read their statement at the hearing. They can choose to read it themselves. They can choose to have somebody read it for them. They can record it so that the victim's involvement is really an integral part of the conditional release process for us. And we have a staff in our regional offices who work with victims to talk about what kind of information would be helpful to the board, because it has to be helpful to that. So when they do come to present their statement, if they do it in person, they can choose to do it by video, because we have, of course, the pandemic has taught us a lot. And so we do, hybrid hearings. But, the evolving needs of victims change a lot just in terms of legislation, process, policy, etc. And our chairperson has established at the Parole Board a victims advisory committee, which is made up of our own staff, but with community members. And they really provide advice and recommendations on, our policy, procedures, training, things that our board members, because board members, as I said a while ago, are appointed for 3 years or 5 years. So, we need to keep innovating. We need to keep being, making sure that, when we invite them, that there is a purpose. And so I hope there's a lot of people out there who are listening and understand that they can register with either, ourselves or the correctional service. And it's one thing to participate, but they can also receive information, about the offender who harmed them. So they can receive, where the offender is incarcerated, when the parole hearing is, etc. So in that sense, there's a lot of openness to, hopefully have victims participate. And for us, the legislation anchored or solidified the victims' participation, but many years before, the board had invited victims for decades already to come and present. And it's part of the hearing. So victims, when they're there, because board members, they manage the hearing, but there could be other observers. You and I could be observing a hearing. We don't get to participate, but we get to observe. And then they can indicate when the victim speaks. And the statement is shared prior so that we follow to make sure that, because in Canada, we have to share information with the offender 15 days before their hearing as well. And so we can't consider information that has not been shared with the offender.
Unfortunately, I was not able to attend the recent World Congress on Probation in Ottawa, but I know you gave a presentation with the team from American Probation and Parole Association. Can you talk a little bit about that presentation this year, Sylvie?
Sure. Actually, you really missed a great Congress. And I know I'm completely biased because it was in Canada. But, the theme of the Congress was Leave No One Behind, Building Community Capacity. And it was really amazing to see people from across the world talk about exactly that. How do we move forward? So I did deliver a session with my colleagues from the Association of Paroling Authorities International about the benefits of partnerships, actually. And so the president of the APAI, Jonathan Ogletree from Kansas, myself, and Jennifer Schaefer from California. Of course, we were led by Ashley Coots, who's the executive director. So we talked about a partnership, and it's actually interesting because it links back to our friend Dr. Sarin, that we were able to, many years ago, I'm going to say about 2010, share our structured decision-making framework called the Risk Assessment Framework at the time with Ralph at APAI, and many states in the U.S. have started using it and amended it in different versions to work for them, but California particularly. And we just spent a week in New York with 10 other U.S. jurisdictions on this exact issue through the APAI and NIC. So that was the presentation. And then I moderated a session from the Parole Board of Canada on gender, diversity, gender, and decision making. So it was really a great opportunity.
Yeah, I was one of the reasons I could not attend was because my travel schedule was a little hectic last fall. So I was actually in Barcelona training for Iwan Dernescu at his international training school on core correctional skills. And I remember having dinner one night with him and Fergus McNeil and everybody, and Willem Vanderbruge, the outgoing president of the Confederation of European Probation. Joe, we missed you in Ottawa. So I thought, in hindsight, well, you all were able to swing this. I should have done it as well. But yeah.
Well, I saw you posted something, and Ian was with you, and I was like, oh, how did he get there so fast? But there you go.
Funny story, and I don't think Iwan will mind me telling him this, but because of his crazy globetrotting schedule, somewhere between Ottawa and Barcelona, his luggage was lost.
Oh no!
So I hope he doesn't get angry with me. But it was a funny story because we were problem solving. We'll just leave it at that. We were problem solving that week in Barcelona. I said again earlier, we don't utilize parole as much here in the U.S. So tell us, and you've mentioned it a couple of times within the context of your work with Dr. Sarin, tell our listeners all about the Association of Paroling Authorities International. What are your experiences with that organization?
Sure. So the APAI, it's a wonderful organization that which the Parole Board in Canada has had long ties with. It's actually U.S.-based international association dedicated to, public safety, reintegration of offender, and they host a variety. I always say it's a very there's a richness of resources in this group because there are not many parole decision makers in the world. There's a lot of parole officers and probation officers, but decision makers tend to be a much, much smaller group. And the APAI really does offer that much needed opportunity for leaders in paroling and releasing authorities to share information, best practices. Every year there's a training event. So it's a training conference hosted by them. Actually in 2023, it will be in Kansas City, Missouri, from April 16th to 19th. And we always think, oh, well, there's a conference, but there's also accessibility all year. So sometimes we want to do things at the Parole Board. A while ago, I talked about our gender and trauma informed, and we actually reached out to our colleagues through the APAI as well to get information to see who's doing what out there, right? Because there's a lot of people doing things, and it's so if you or your listeners are interested, the APAI is on Twitter, on Facebook, but they're also online, and it's an I should have asked them to tell me how many countries and states are members, but it's fairly big association.
What I will do, Sylvie, I will leave a link. I'm sure there's some sort of a website or link associated with them. I'll leave that link right in the description of this podcast episode. So if listeners are intrigued, they can simply click on that link and go down that rabbit hole, as I'm going to do as well.
Perfect.
Sylvie, you and I both believe there's so much to be learned from our global partners. Could you share an example maybe of something that really sticks out to you as to this philosophy?
Yeah, I thought about that question a bit recently because I'm thinking of doing something else with another colleague, and it really comes back to what do we learn from each other and why we do what we do. And, it really comes down to we can't do what we do on an island, or at least we shouldn't do it on an island. And I think meaningful engagement with partners is the key to everything. So certainly for me, I talk about the risk assessment, our structured decision making tool that we share. We've been using it at the Parole Board for, almost 13 years, yet we participate in a community of practice with NIC, and we come back with great ideas on how we can change it and amend it and, make it, keep it, relevant. And so for me, I think you always, need your partners, and there's a lot of research out there that we can access. And, for us at the board in Canada, because we, the staff is the constant for one, board members come and go, but, we're independent and we can't be influenced, and, but we can be, trained and research and, all of these other things. So there's a difference between our decision making and where we go with that, and the things that we need to learn because it's 2022. And, so for sure the global partners and the, not having the philosophy of going down our own, rabbit holes by ourselves, and we do what we do because we do it well. We do it well because we are very engaged, I think.
Yeah, I had this conversation recently with some colleagues, and you just hit on that same chord of sort of striking that balance between fidelity when we implement these evidence-based practices, core correctional skills, core correctional practices, but also the realization that we can't get so rigid that we don't see the forest from the trees. And we get that way, as you said, by looking at how our global partners are operating. I mean, I could just cite, for example, even Sylvie, much of the world, fortunately, I think, operates under the risk need responsivity framework. Speaking of Canadians, thank you, Dr. Bonta and the late Don Andrews. But that being said, we also have things like the Good Lives model or the emerging desistance model. So we can't get so rigid in our implementation that we lose sight of the forest from the trees.
No, I just wanted to say, we follow a fairly, I'm going to say, small piece of legislation. Like, our authorities are very clear, in law, but it doesn't mean you can't innovate in other ways, right? Through our hearings, through our, I talked about trauma informed and gender informed, and, Black offenders, Indigenous offenders having hearings that you just bring more to it. So I think that's, fascinating.
Yeah, I'm going to steal that language. I like that. We need to learn to strike that balance between fidelity and innovation, and realize that the two can coexist.
Yeah.
What is on the horizon for Sylvie Blanchet? Sylvie, if I've got you back on the show in a year or two, what do you think we might be talking about? Look into your crystal ball.
So my crystal ball hopefully says that we are continuing great advancements in risk assessment and research, but I really do hope that we continue to innovate and we pay attention to the people that need us to be, innovators. So, when I talked about marginalized groups, or, that we're not just treating everybody the same way. And I think that conversation continues, and definitely I'm sure that in a year or two, that's what we would be talking about, and hopefully other great things that are, have come to light about parole and how we can help people reintegrate into the community.
Sylvie Blanchet, thank you so much for joining us on this special American Probation and Parole Association edition of the Criminologist Podcast. And I do look forward to having you back to talk about some of those groundbreaking things that you are consistently involved with. Thanks again, Sylvie.
Thank you very much, Joe. It was great to be here.
Yes, a huge round of applause indeed for Sylvie Blanchet, joining us all the way from Moncton, New Brunswick, up in Canada. As promised, I have left several links in the episode description of this program, including the website for the Association of Paroling Authorities International. You heard Sylvie mention this entity during her interview, or if you are intrigued, rather, I encourage you to check that out. I've also left links regarding American Probation and Parole Association's great work, in particular, links to their winter regional training institutes. A great opportunity to connect with friends and colleagues as the American Probation and Parole Association hosts its first ever 5 regional training events with 5 programs at each location of presenters, engaging sessions, and of course, exhibit areas. You can experience valuable training at substantial savings due to reduced travel expenses. For example, if you are in Columbus, they will be one of the areas for a regional training institute, as well as New Orleans, the Big Easy, Omaha, Nebraska, Philadelphia, the city of brotherly love, and of course, Los Angeles, representing the West Coast members and those in that area. These winter training institutes are really your opportunity to hone in on your personal development. This is your chance to explore the future of probation and parole technologies and where our industry is headed. You can also discover best practices and strategies to enhance your everyday work. And of course, if you're like me, you'll leave these training institutes much more inspired with a focus on ideas and information that you can bring back to your office and back to your coworkers. These will kick off in January of 2023. The first of these winter regional training institutes will take place in Columbus, Ohio from January 23rd until January 25th. Next, we're off to New Orleans, where we will be hosting an institute from January 29th through the 31st. Getting into the Midwest, Omaha, Nebraska, February 5th through the 7th. Shooting out to the East Coast, Philadelphia, February 12th through the 14th. And wrapping up in Los Angeles from February 26th to February 28th. I have not yet decided which institute I will be attending, but I'll let you know. Hopefully we can connect at one of these great events. We will be back next week with a fresh episode. In the meantime, you may contact the show or reach out to us through our website, the Paragon Group, LLC.com, for training or presentations as to core correctional skills, implementation, or of course, the topic of desistance from crime. If you have questions or comments as to this podcast, feel free to contact the show via our email at thecriminologistpodcast@gmail.com. That's thecriminologistpodcast@gmail.com. Remember to follow us through our Facebook and LinkedIn pages at The Criminologist Podcast. New fun images are being added all the time to those feeds. You don't want to miss out. The Criminologist Media Group is also on Twitter. Give us a follow at Crim Media Group. That's CRIM Media Group. You may also connect with me, Joseph Arvidsson, on LinkedIn and follow both the Criminologist Podcast and the Paragon Group on our LinkedIn pages. Hey, lastly, if you've not already done so, check out and subscribe to our YouTube channel, The Criminologist, for additional content as to the themes of this program. Merchandise is now available. If you visit our website, theparagongroup.llc.com, you'll see a tab entitled Shop. Go ahead and click on that and find out how you can get your cool criminologist refrigerator magnet, coffee mug, or pen for the home or office. And if you believe in what we're doing on the program, if you're part of the movement, please spread the word, tell a friend or a coworker or a colleague about us, ask them to subscribe to the podcast, and of course, do so yourself if you've not already done so. And always remember, folks, there's no them, there's only us.
I'm thinking of doing something else with another colleague, and it really comes back to what do we learn from each other and why we do what we do. And it really comes down to we can't do what we do on an island, or at least we shouldn't do it on an island. And I think meaningful engagement with partners is the key to everything.
The Criminologist Podcast is a production of the Paragon Group, LLC. For speaking engagements, interviews, program design, or training opportunities, please visit us at theparagongroup.llc.com. If you enjoyed the show, you can find more content and videos on our YouTube channel, The Criminologist. Don't forget to like and subscribe. Both the Criminologist Podcast and the Criminologist channel are brought to you by the Criminologist Media Group. Be sure to give us a 5-star review, and thanks for listening.